So I'm going to start the presentation now. This is the tricky part. I've got a PowerPoint lined up. How do we get that to go? Dr. Beaver?
Down at the bottom, there should be a green share screen button. You should click it, choose this appropriate screen, and
share screen is on my, oh, okay, over here, share screen. And then I click the PowerPoint.
Correct. Okay. Yep, and we all should see it. Hey, lovely.
Did it pop up? And then I just hit start, right?
You can. You won't be able to see anything else on your screen if you do that, but yes.
Well, how else do I get the PowerPoint play?
You either have to click through it, or you can go ahead and hit play. Just try it. See what happens. It'll be great. We're experimenting.
I'm waiting for Marissa to pipe in through text and technology. You're right. I can't see a thing.
Do it. Do it. Press the button.
Teaching plan for cultural competency. So I wanted to try to share some of that with you. Let's look at some features of the philosophical positions of these three moral judgments. Moral absolutism is the ethical belief that there are absolute standards against which moral questions can be judged, and that certain actions are right or wrong, regardless of the context of the act.
Sterling, if you can, turn up your speakers so we can hear a little bit better.
Turn off a speaker?
Nope, turn up your speakers, because we're listening to your computer.
Oh. Where would that speaker be?
Moral absolutism also differs from moral pluralism, which urges respect of others' moral principles without concluding that all views are equally valid. Moral absolutism tends to be intolerant of other cultures and customs. Moral judgments are true or false, and actions are right or wrong, only relative to a particular standpoint, such as the moral guidelines of a specific community or culture. No particular standpoint can be proved objectively superior to any other. Since moral relativism pertains to a particular standpoint or context, there are no universal truths or universal moral standards. And since moral relativism pertains to a particular standpoint or context, it does not promote divergence. Moral relativism trends towards tolerance, not respect. Moral pluralism occupies a sensible middle ground between there is only one right answer, as absolutism says, and there is no wrong answer, as relativism claims.
I tell you, I don't get no respect at all.
Moral pluralism urges respect for others' moral principles without accepting that all views are equally valid. Pluralism recognizes universal morality and universal values. For this reason, pluralism can contextualize aspects of other cultures without having a sense of obligation to adopt those values. As cultural competence in healthcare refers to the ability for healthcare professionals to demonstrate cultural competence towards patients with diverse values, beliefs, and feelings, moral pluralism seems to be the best application. In the healthcare setting, religion and spirituality are prevalent considerations of diversity. Obviously, with ethnic diversity, a broader spectrum of beliefs are expected, and those beliefs are fundamental for the diversity of traditions that we associate with various cultures. The spirituality-religion dynamic is a key cultural consideration. Spirituality assessment is beneficial in a clinical setting for many reasons regarding respect for patients' care, not the least of which is that it is required by JCOA. Therefore, a broad definition of spirituality suffices to expedite the obligation to address spiritual needs of all patients. Versus a broader approach to attending patient spirituality in a clinical setting, a concise and distinct definition for spirituality is better suited for research in order to both quantify how spiritual a person is and describe in what ways spirituality is expressed.
Okay, so am I back live? No. Am I muted again? I see George going yes.
You're good.
I can hear you.
No, you're good.
So that was the first part of the presentation. So yeah, we're supposed to create a teaching strategy for cultural competence, I guess, with this first semester. That's kind of the final. I don't know what all we only have like a month left, but I don't know what all that entails as far as how detailed they want it. But I'm hoping to clean up the PowerPoint presentation. That'll be part of my teaching strategy. So we've got a lot more to do, but there's references, quite a bit of reference to how to address different cultures. My exposure here in Orlando, Central Florida is and of course I'm not a direct caregiver, but we have not had a whole lot of real dramatic problems. For instance, there's a Sikh temple close by, and I've never seen a Sikh in the hospital, yet we had a case study where a gentleman came in and he needed a inguinal cath to do a heart cath, and a nurse came in to shave him, and he pulled out his dagger, or more than a dagger, it's a curved spear, and that's one of the items that a devout Sikh carries, including a wooden comb and having all the body hair. And she thought it was a problem with her being a young lady. So she went to the nursing station and got a guy to come in, and he went in, I think he was the nursing supervisor at the time, and he pulled out the razor, and the Sikh again responded with quite a violent act. He spoke English, but he had a heavy accent. He said, "Nobody is cutting any hair, period." And that's because for the Sikhs, I don't think any of us knew, not a hair on the body. I thought it was beard and head hair, but not a hair on the body ever gets removed. So, and that's part of the holy, sacred thing. So that's kind of the type of stuff that we're covering, what to expect, how different cultures approach death. Some, of course, have reincarnation, but they have reincarnation in different forms. The Jains, I think that's what you would call them. The Jains reincarnate in a different form, whereas Hindus are the same, basically the same soul that keeps coming back. And Buddhists don't reincarnate at all. And so how they would handle death or that confrontation it's pretty interesting. Yeah. So any questions so far?
I have a question.
Please.
You got me thinking, Sterling, about the relationship between moral pluralism and ethical contextualism, right? So you're using both those terms in setting up your landscape. I like where you start, that there's a I don't know, practical space between absolutism and relativism.
Right.
Something I've talked with you about before, but also I've talked with my undergraduates a lot. Like, there are very few strict relativists and strict absolutists. Most of us work in between in a practical sense. But what that in between looks like is really important. And I don't know. I guess maybe I don't have a very clear sense for myself about the space between pluralism and contextualism. And I wondered if we could all talk that through, or you had any thoughts there. I've got a couple of things I could.
No, I mean, I had a problem just separating pluralism, bless you, pluralism from relativism until I read it over and over again, that relativism is, I mean, most people think, well, relativism is anything goes and we accept everything. Yet it's contextual for a particular space and time, and that's which, relative at the moment, and therefore there are universal standards, and we know that there are universal moralities where the relative, when in Rome, do as the Romans, I guess, would be a relative approach, but we know that that's not, something's inherently, there's always something wrong there. And so I found that relativism, a lot of people feel patronized by relativism. And where I had the slide about tolerance versus respect, relativism is tolerant, not necessarily respectful. And I found quite a few instances where people, if you just tolerate them, sometimes they're offended. They recognize it. They feel patronized and they recognize it. Yeah. But where you're talking about contextualism, now you're going on another plane above. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like what you were talking about is the distinction between relativism and contextualism. So if the relativist thinks there's no way I can make moral evaluations because, as you put it, like anything goes, kind of, right? Everybody's got their own unique value perspective, and that shuts down the evaluative process. Like, I can't make any claims about my view being worse or better than yours. But if you're a contextualist, you say relativism, ethical standards and principles and evaluative claims are made in a specific context. So whether that's time-based or social, society-based or whatever, there's some sort of constraints on where we can make moral evaluations. So for instance, right, we can morally evaluate perfectly fine right now that, and this is the example I give in my graduate workshops, like punting puppies across the mall, totally a bad thing to do, right? But if you went back, I don't know, in a different cultural context or several hundred years, or even in a smaller, like
puppies never acceptable.
Puppy punting context, right? Then you could say, well, in this context, it's acceptable, right? Morally acceptable. So that contextualism is a kind of relativism, but it's not a strict universal relativism. So there's a distinction there to be made. But then the thing that I was getting at, that I was worrying about, was the relationship between contextualism and pluralism. So if I'm a pluralist about values, then what I think is there's no best method for evaluating a moral claim, right? So if I say puppy punting is wrong, you might say, well, yeah, but only if you take a strict deontological view where puppies are like, I don't know, sacred organisms or something. I don't know what it would be, right? The pluralist would say, well, yeah, but that's only one tool we've got.
But you're going back to basic ethics, where anyone's going to argue whether, where they got their ethical standard from, right? Is that kind of, I mean, I felt like
maybe
that I read was pluralism there are some universal ethical standards that that everybody should, and everything they always go to slavery or trafficking people or something, that's just regardless of the culture or the time and date, that's just not the thing to do, so there are some universal
Yeah, so this is where like this is where I'm a little I don't have very sure footing. So if you're a principlist, like in the context of bioethics, principlism is a form of pluralism, and the principlist says for sure there are universal principles, right?
Mhm.
Right. So and this is kind of like a deontological claim where there's certain norms or certain principles of action um, that are universal, or they stand regardless of time or context. That's right. But I'm not sure that every pluralist thinks that there's universal guidelines. Like pluralism is about the method of analysis, not the content. And I think that's what I was, at least in my head, that's where I'm thinking. Pluralism is a methodological claim, and contextualism is a content claim, I
Okay.
think. But again, I feel like I can't cite anything to
See,
tell you that's
to
true.
me, contextualism, the way you're saying, it kind of describes relativism because it's within a context, a particular time, place, context. So that sounds,
Yeah.
uh,
That's
that
right.
makes
And
me
again,
talk.
like if you want to be a strict relativist, you think the context is at the level of the individual, so that there's no sort of group level evaluative claims we can make. That's like hard moral relativism. That's right. Yep.
So, and then I don't know if I can make one slide just pop up, can I?
Yep. I see that one.
Oh, did that pop up?
Sure did.
Versus broader approach, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Okay. So I frequently reference Harold Koenig at Duke because, and this runs through the approach to cultural competency in a hospital or a clinical setting. He explained you use a broad pluralistic approach to accept and figure out how to be very inclusive. Whereas in his research settings, where he's trying to find, trying to home in on whether spirituality has positive or beneficial results to healthcare, a broad approach lends itself to more criticism and more ways of finding fault in the research. So the tighter he can get the, so for research, he tries to get a definition of spirituality and religion more concise, not broad and encompassing and inclusive. So that's, I'm putting that there because the next slide or the next little presentation of 4 or 5 minutes, we'll talk about, and I did this part I found it very interesting, but I did it for us, for the ethics, because they found quite a few, and Koenig is a psychology background, so he saw a lot more psychological benefits, and that's easier to measure than physical benefits. But the results, and they've measured they've had brain measurements showing beneficial results in happiness through stimulus through different behaviors. Altruism being kind of the one that's why I put the altruistic behind me, is the one that seems to have the greatest response. And since our morals are kind of built on a feedback mechanism of reward, I thought it was interesting that altruism can be very anonymous, and the more anonymous their altruistic behavior was, the higher the reward. Not the higher the reward was, but the benefits seemed better. So altruistically, you don't get a rewards per se, but the results as far as happiness and better outlook on life seem to peak and be higher than the ones that did volunteer work and got reward. So, and Dr. Beaver left for something. So I don't know if I don't think I can where I should start is everybody muted now? Okay. We lost.
I can be unmuted.
Well, I was going to start the other.
Yeah, I don't know where he went, but we could discuss some of the things that you just
Okay.
mentioned, or that, you know, other participants might have questions on before we segue to the next topic. I was interested in what he said, that he thought contextualism was more about content and pluralism was more about method.
And I'm not going to be able to answer. I won't be able to answer that.
But do you agree at least that pluralism, relativism, and absolutism for you are about method?
Well, I believe they fall under procedural moral procedures, so that would make me think it's a method. They're categorized as moral procedures. Yeah, that in fact, ethical conceptualism. That's what he said, right? Yeah, that's a term that I mean, I've heard it before, but not frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the rhetoric of it, it sounds a lot more like relativism, because relativism deals with a contextualized space. Oh, there he is.
Sorry.
Is the cat giving you fits?
What's that?
Is the cat giving you fits?
Cat? No, not today. No, no. Got people coming to my door asking for things. So
Meals on wheels.
got it.
Okay, so should we start the other little thingy?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, and I just hit start again. I just hit play.
I would guess so. It doesn't look like it's in this slide deck, right? Do you have a different PowerPoint?
Yeah.
I'll have to share a different.
Let me close that one.
Just hit share screen again. Share a new one.
Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. And then the microphone thing, I didn't get that. So I just turned the monitor up.
Yep, that's perfect.
With regards to today's Center for Ethics presentation, we've come to a crossroads. Yogi Berra had something to say about that. To reiterate where we left off before the short break, a concise definition of spirituality is better suited for research in order to both quantify how spiritual a person is and describe in what ways spirituality is expressed. So let's look at more research considerations. Medical humanities professor David H. Hufford of Penn State explores the experiential basis for belief in the supernatural, explains spirituality as a personal relationship to the transcendent, and religion as a community or institutional aspects of spirituality. Koenig reasons that to call something spiritual, it must have some connection to religion or the supernatural. If not, it is humanistic. Studies reveal that greater religious involvement is related to better health. Evidence supports benefits to mental health, but much less substantial for physical health. In research, the spiritual but not religious patients are combined with the non-religious group, showing poorer beneficial results. Regardless of the argument, supernatural phenomena has been neither proved or disproved. Hence, for research applications, assessments of religious influences on physical health are determined through psychological, social, and behavioral factors.
What was that?
Psychoneuroimmunology, PNI, is the study of the interaction between psychological processes in both nervous and immune systems. The anterior prefrontal cortex has shown substantial expansion in humans compared with non-human primates. Evidence shows that the hub of morality is the prefrontal cortex, guiding activity to other nodes of the neuromoral network. Those brain regions that make us uniquely human. The prefrontal cortex, when functioning correctly, controls the mental option to delay immediate gratification for a more rewarding long-term gratification result. Human altruism has been shown to exceed rewarding interpersonal and economic factors. Altruistic decisions involve sacrificing material interests for social welfare. Altruistic behavior draws on the mammalian neural dynamics of reward. Furthermore, altruism tied to moral beliefs relies on the anterior prefrontal cortex. Altruistic behavior appears to have high PNI benefits. For example, a study titled Measures of Hindu Pathways compared the 4 religious pathways engaged in varying degrees amongst practicing Hindus, the paths of ethical action, knowledge, devotion, and discipline. Hindus indulging in the path of ethical action were individuals choosing to work without attachment to its effects. This pathway is sought by practitioners to purify one's mind so that he or she may attain a sense of God vision, consequently yielding some of the greatest emotional and social benefits in the study. In my lay understanding, there appears to be a relationship between rewards influencing moral beliefs. Yet anonymous altruism would tend to lack tangible rewards. Yet this is where we see the greatest benefits. As an adjunct with the research, Green speculates that utilitarian moral philosophy reflects an underlying tension between subsystems of the brain. Does utilitarianism lend itself to develop an agonist temperament? Multiple regions of the frontal and parietal cortex are engaged to resolve moral dilemmas in which utilitarian applications violate personal moral values. Therefore, utilitarian judgments often require greater brain activity.
So that was that. Look at Dr. Beaver's just shaking his head.
The toilet paper got me there for a minute.
Well, I'm fiddling around with these sound effects. I got better as I went along. Obviously, the first. Anyway, so
So,
well,
so
it wasn't going to be Python-esque.
yes, I like it. I like the squirrel too in the tree above Dr. Kubler and I at the beginning. That was so Sterling, give us the central thesis to the second presentation, because you had a lot going on there.
The central thesis, there wasn't really. So I think the central thesis was, and I think while you stepped away and put the fig leaf up, that Koenig and is doing all this research and finding these, looking into the benefits. And as I explained, he had a psychology background, and our morality, based in the anterior prefrontal cortex, kind of responds to reward system. Our morality develops from some reward from things that we do or thoughts that we have, or anyway, it's a process. But my point that I was telling them when you stepped away was altruism you would think doesn't really, if it's anonymous altruism anyway, that doesn't really get a reward response, a tangible reward response. Yet that altruism tends to have the highest, the greatest appeal for benefits, or benefit for in the studies. Altruistic behavior, where people do things anonymously, tends to have they're happier than people that get some reward from doing their volunteer work, or recognition from doing volunteer work. I thought that was interesting. And then the last part I was just saying, I found that study on the utilitarianism tends to have, I guess some utilitarians have a personal tension about what utilitarian does versus their own morality. That was where that came in, that there's, according to that study, they found different parts of the brain being stimulated during utilitarian judgments versus other morality, based judgment, where it be deontological or whatever. So that was, it's kind of eclectic, but I wanted to present that for you, because it's Center for Ethics.
Yeah. Especially when you, during the slide, when you made the sort of the central claim, as I took it to be of the presentation, that was altruism has the greatest benefits, but isn't rewarded. I was like, wait, tell me more, go slower. Because I mean, first of all, there should be some data there. I imagine somebody's done some study that we could lean on to better understand what that looks like. But what you were after, there was a little bit of tension, because what you were after was the claim that it doesn't have any immediate rewards, but it's got long-term benefits, right?
Yes.
So there's kind of like so the moral psychologist, somebody like Jonathan Haidt, might say altruism has some evolutionary benefits to, any organism that is altruistic or develops altruism, because it sets up a habit of relationships that benefits the individual in the long term, but it doesn't have any immediate rewards. And the key difference between this prefrontal awards thing that you discussed is that that's what it's focused on. It's like, what's the immediate gratification I get from somebody saying, oh, thank you so much, Lakeland, for picking me up off the curb when I fell down, right? You all of a sudden get that little hit of endorphins that make you feel like I've done something good. Whereas that's not the case with altruism. And I think that's a really important point.
Exactly. And so Koenig has measured a lot. He has quite a few measurements of, from something that I read, that we were required to read, that he mentioned altruism really has kind of stimulates this better feeling versus just doing good works or behaving morally. So I included that Hindu study because I want to go out beyond Koenig into whole nother culture and say, here's something that they found, which parallel.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that reach. One of the ways to understand that difference maybe is through Green. So if Green's claim is that, and in your example, it was restricted to utilitarian reasoning, but the idea that ethical decision-making isn't restricted to our prefrontal cortex. Like, ethical decision-making isn't just that feeling I get. The things that are restricted there are like habit and reward systems. But ethical decision-making is such a complex set of conditions. It uses lots of different parts of the brain. So there's a utilitarian piece of making a decision where you do a calculation, like what are the risks and benefits or whatever, but that's all coupled to, especially coming back to your pluralism idea, coupled to these bigger value claims from which I start, and from habits of my behavior in the past, and from external conditions and relationships. And so your brain this is the trouble with these studies, is that you can only study one piece of the brain at a time. But we know that lots of different pieces of the brain are involved in ethical decision making. So there's some risk, and I don't think you made this error, but like there's some risk in saying, well, we've got it covered, right? Like Green told us that utilitarianism is, that's the way to go because I don't know, whatever the reason.
No, I think his study just showed that there was some tension
Yeah, right.
There was competing parts of the brain that say, okay, my utilitarian values say this versus my, well, in Sterling, it would be natural law, right? Tend to be natural law ethics, so utilitarian versus, and, and we've talked about not getting stuck on one ethical philosophy and being purist on any of that. Is we've talked about pragmatism and changing our ethical philosophies depending on the
But
topic.
this is what's so interesting. I mean, philosophers make this mistake all the time, I think, of teaching students and then thinking themselves that, oh, I'm a strict utilitarian, or I'm a natural law theorist. And really, I mean, even if you think yourself a natural law theorist, you're still informed by this bigger landscape of strategies for reasoning about value claims. So things sneak in, and I think this is the work of ethics education, really, is to get people to think, okay, so what strategies have snuck into my decision-making process, even if I think I'm a strict utilitarian, right?
Well, I mean, we've talked about it, and I've read quite a bit that in decision making or moral decision making, I don't know if it's just this country or worldwide, tends to be utilitarian. Utilitarian has a strong foothold on making decisions, and I don't remember the other. I feel like it was deontological were the top two that are kind of leaned upon more often, and natural law was, kind of, it used to be a stronger consideration, as far as, when everybody comes to the table, right, and they're hashing it out. But you and I spoke about it in bioethics in a hospital setting. Natural law has a better foothold or standing. They kind of have better cards in their hand when they're at the table discussing healthcare or that type of thing versus other settings. I believe we've talked about that anyway.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Yeah, I never know what to make of generalizations about how most of us reason, because it seems like when the sort of people who would say to me, most of us make decisions by utilitarian reasoning, I feel like most of those people are thinking about economics, right? How do I evaluate risk and benefits? And this happens at the university too. Like when we're making ethical decisions, what we're really doing is just evaluating risk. And we're saying like, well, the right thing to do is to minimize risk to the institution. But what's at risk when we do that is all of the values that all of us bring to the table in the first place. So it's easy to say we reason calculatively as utilitarians, but there's so much more going on. It's not like all values are created equal and all risks are the same risks, and there's some sort of like brute calculus we can do on decision making. So in some ways, this is why I feel I try to be fair, but sometimes I slip into just straight up advocating for pluralism, because I think, I see normative theories as strategies. So whether it's natural law or whether it's contractualism or deontology or utilitarianism or care or virtue or whatever, I could go on and on, right? These are strategies for thinking through value conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing all of them all the time. And the clearer we can get on the rules of the game for each theory, the richer our analysis can be. So yeah, and I'm stuck on the green thing about utilitarianism decision making. I'll look forward to reading more about that. I don't think I know that piece well.
Well, I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting.
Yeah, no, it totally is. And so for this project for your class, Sterling, is it going to be a combination of the first presentation and the second?
No. The second part was pretty much for us, for the Center for Ethics, because and that was part of the original topic about making classifying spirituality as the broad base, so you can be inclusive in a hospital or clinical setting of everybody, versus the research aspect. That was another part that I was trying to central focus that Koenig points out. In order to make qualified measurements in study, you can't really have you open up to a broad base, then you're opening up to a lot more criticism in your research, you know,
Right.
versus a focused, defined approach. Yeah. I can see Dr. Kubler just biting at the John at the bit. No? No?
Yep. I had a question. I wondered if anyone here knows if there's any research out there that can say something about which type of method a person tends to use in their ethical reasoning, depending upon their level of attachment or association with the problem or information that they have or personal experience. So, for example, I wager, based on no empirical data at all, that if you take a random person on the street and you say, here's an ethical problem, what should you do? If they have no immediate personal understanding of the problem, or don't know anyone who's, experienced that situation, I'm guessing people would tend to lean on on an absolutist approach. Whereas if you provide them with information that maybe helps them understand, the immediate or potential harms or outcomes that may result from an ethical situation, or if it's the kind of thing that touches them personally, I come up with an example, then they may tend to be a little bit more relativist or pluralist. And I think if we understood that, if it's not been done, if we understood that, it might be useful for us understanding how to approach certain things that have ethical dimension, or even connect to things like public policy. There's a longstanding argument out there that men are too involved in trying to make decisions about things like abortion. There's clearly ethical issues associated. People will use the term agency. You don't have agency to make that decision, Steve, because you don't have a womb. And I can see a lot to that. Maybe if I were a woman, maybe if I'd had personal experience, maybe if I'd had the misfortune of having children who, might have been born, if we'd known in advance with birth defects, maybe I'd have different views on an abortion issue, right? For me, it seems like that silly trolley problem is so interesting and so informative. I know it's just a construct, but you go through that with people who haven't thought about ethics, and people tend to be very utilitarian about it until you start qualifying and providing more information that maybe connects them more and personalizes the problem, and then it changes. So I guess I'm just wondering, how much is the method that we embrace or tend to use in any particular situation affected by how much we're forced to use our prefrontal cortex, or our sense of abstractness, versus our sense of personal and human understanding of a situation? You only get 10-minute questions with me. It takes me 10 minutes.
That's fine. No, I loved it. Yeah, you always express yourself very well. Don't stumble around like I do.
So, Dr. Beaver, do you know the answer to that? Have people studied that, or is it a moot point because no, you haven't understood the point of method and what we mean? Or
No, I can't name any data-driven studies of people's perceptions of that relationship, but it seems like there's plenty of evidence. Sort of the more you know, the richer you can argue. So again, this comes back to the idea that our ethical values are coupled to our whatever epistemic stance. Like the way we know and what we know informs what we value and how we value it. And I think a lot of this can circle back around to our political context, right? There's so much slipperiness with how knowledge is shared and developed, and how truth is asserted and claimed and evidenced, that there's a whole bunch of people who are underinformed or differently informed about particular issues. And so part of the work is not only asserting value claims, but evidencing those claims through knowledge. And it's that, go Sterling, go.
No, I don't want to interrupt you. Keep talking. No.
I could keep talking forever. You got to interrupt me.
I was just going to say, don't you, and you and I haven't had this conversation, don't you think, like, if you were just to ask somebody in their background, the golden rule is kind of what people are familiar with, and that would be their you know, if you were to ask them something, regardless of what Dr. Kubler says, you know, beneficial to myself or something, I go, okay, step back, take a deep breath. I would think a novice would think, okay, the golden rule is pretty good, right? I mean, you know, well, in his context where he said you walk up to somebody in the street and you say, hey, how do you feel about this particular issue? And then if they're not putting themselves, you know, what advantage is it to me? They might step back and say, well, I'm familiar with it. I feel pretty good about the golden rule. That's a pretty standard way to go. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think that's a great example of maybe one of Dr. Kubler's concerns. And that is, like, I think you're right. If I ask the average American on the street, how do you feel about the golden rule? They're going to intuitively say, great, right? And then if you ask them, okay, what do you know about the golden rule? Where did it come from? You know, what does it mean? What are the details of it? How does it apply to the particular case, maybe abortion, right? Some hot button issue. They're going to break down. I think you're going to see a whole bunch of variants around what people know and how they're interpreting this intuitive value claim. The golden rule is a good thing. I think everybody can give you some definition of what that rule is, but the way it applies is contingent on other beliefs and
absolutely
range of your knowledge. So yeah, I mean, our intuitions, this is where I get so pissed at moral psychologists who want us to lean on the power of intuitions, right? That they blind us and they bind us, in Jonathan Haidt's terms. I think that's crap. I mean, it might be a starting point, but.
Well, so I was kind of thinking the other way. You don't ask somebody what the golden rule is. You just ask them a public policy question. What do you think about this? And once they take a breath, they think back to themselves. Okay, well, I'll just lean on the golden rule. You know, not asking them if you know what the golden rule means, but
no, I would wager that is so far from the norm.
No, okay.
I would wager if you pick any issue that's even the slightest bit hot, climate change, abortion, the election, whatever, the role of Facebook, I would pick something, right? People are going to have a strong gut instinct that's going to be driven by either crap they read online or some value that they have that they built their identity around, right?
Okay.
I think
would be what?
Lakeland had a point.
So what?
I want to hear what Lakeland had to say because I could see her raising a point.
Yeah, speak up.
To this topic, there is a lot of research from my background. So coming from a risk and crisis communication standpoint and looking at the topics that you all keep mentioning, things like abortion, like more controversial policy issues, we do have a lot of research in my field looking at proxemics as a factor of how people perceive and act during some of these issues. So as far as like Dr. Kubler, the examples you brought up, right? Proxemics in my field says that if the further away, either in time, in space, in relation, in whatever, you know, you can kind of define proxemics as, the further away it is or further removed from a person it is, the less they internalize it and feel and perceive actionable items as relevant and necessary to take. Whereas the closer it is proxemic wise, or the more associated they are with it because they've experienced it, it's, you know, there's a hurricane right outside your door, you have a family member who is going to be affected by it or what have you, we know that the more likely actionable items will be perceived as relevant, will be taken, will be whatever. Now, to take it to your level, I don't know of research, especially in my field, that has taken it that step further to look at that in relation to ethical paradigms and ethical epistemologies and ontologies and things like that. But I don't really know if that's helpful or if that like gets at what we were kind of talking about, but I just wanted to kind of bring in some literature that I know.
I found it very useful. I found you have command of the terminology that I don't with proxemics. And your point's well taken that it may inform how people communicate or make decisions, and yet doesn't tell us maybe what kind of I guess ethical analytic method they're using. And so maybe what I was thinking is, okay, let's look at the research that you're describing, and now let's do a word analysis in their reasoning. Is their reasoning tending to lean more on the abstract, or is it tending to lean more on language that you might find in a pluralist or relativist's justification? And I was wagering, oh, it'll tend to be more abstract if you're not proximate to the problem, because it is abstract, because you don't have firsthand experience with it, because it doesn't directly affect you. So you are projecting and prognosticating, extrapolating without, good understanding of maybe what the competing values are, to make that decision. So I really liked that contribution. And going back to some things that were said earlier, I think, sorry, it's very cold in our office here. I've put in so I'm chattering here. I have actually put in a work order. It's, I have my infrared thermometer, and it's like 64 degrees. I don't know what's going on, but it's building wide. So bear with me here. I'm going to get my Arctic parka on. Going back to the golden rule. Yeah, I think a lot of people do have a knee-jerk reaction and an attitude toward things, and maybe don't think in terms of the golden rule. But I would go further and say, even if you say, hey, what about the golden rule, and try to force them to analyze within that context, I think the lack of proxemics would still not change the outcome, because someone would say, well, I don't want you to do that to me, but they don't understand what do to me means. If you're living in territory that is not being threatened by rise in sea levels, you really don't understand what it means to lose your island nation. I don't understand what it means to lose my island nation, although I'm looking at Miami with some trepidation. And I am from Louisiana, which loses about a mile of coastline per year. So, maybe I have some idea, but not enough to really understand how bad climate change is for them folks, right? At the same time, you may not believe that, the greater number of wildfires in California has anything to do with climate change. But I bet if your house burns down because you're living there, you're suddenly proximically forced to reevaluate the golden rule. So yeah, I think the golden rule is a great principle. And I think a lot of people actually do embrace it. But I'm saying their capacity to embrace it really depends critically on this proxemics. And that's why what it informs me is that we have an ethical responsibility before making decisions to gain some proxemics, to become informed, to, listen to the report or the story that explains the situation in a balanced way. And if you're not going to spend the time to do that, well, then stay the hell out of the situation. Basically, don't render your opinion. Or, there's a certain amount of ethical, I would think, duty to trust expertise. I don't have the proxemics myself to be able to go and judge whether certain economic theories are right or wrong, because I'm not an economist. Similarly, although I'm a scientist, I don't have much to say about climate change other than to trust the climatologists. But for that much more reason, I really bristle when people who are not scientists say, well, I'm not sure if I believe in this climate change thing. It's not up to you to believe it or not. It's out there and it's just going to happen. You're too distant. You don't have the proxemics, if you will, to be able to understand the competing values. So it seems to me that the golden rule is great, but it's an issue about application. And I suspect we're much more abstract and not being pluralist enough maybe to make a lot of these decisions. And to me, it underscores the need to really be informed if you're going to participate in any of these kinds of discussions.
Right.
It's
Well,
really,
go for it.
It really makes me think of like the concept of suffering and different religions' attitude towards it, because there are religions like Buddhism and Catholicism where suffering is valued, and it's kind of like that way to experience like context within yourself and build empathy. But there's other religions where it's not, where there's no long-term gain from this suffering, and it's kind of like, well, you can get your rewards now or sooner, like you don't have to worry about it. So different religious viewpoints will have different attitudes towards this golden rule versus these more like specific relativistic views.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think too, to kind of bring it back around to the main topic at hand, looking at like religion or spirituality, health, and ethics, and that sort of intersection, I think what you see or what we may witness going on right now with COVID-19 is a like great example, even in bringing up the golden rule too, with how people who are religious or have religious leanings or spiritual leanings and are removed from the reality of COVID-19 because they haven't experienced it, they don't know anybody who's experienced it in their state, everything's open or what have you, they may say, yes, golden rule, I follow it, I live by it, it's me, it follows my religious tradition, whatever. But then you get into a situation like COVID-19 and they're not following it, right? Or like you could ask, like, okay, well, there's a disconnect there. And I think that proxemics has a lot to do with that, like Dr. Kubler, you were saying. So I just kind of wanted to situate it in maybe perhaps not more relevant, that's not right, but more timely, maybe example, and one that I think attends to Sterling's presentation that he did really well.
Oh, thank you. I did have a go around. So Dr. Bieber, when you said you think people don't go to the golden rule, they are, I guess, centrally thinking of how it affects themselves. I'm not sure exactly what you said. So, but my question is, so what normative, is that egoism? Is that some sort of, what exactly would you classify that approach to, the best you can, just to keep it clear?
Yeah, I think if we're just talking about how people's first take on an ethical issue, I think probably if I had to ism it, it would be intuitionism, right? The idea that we've got some habituated gut reaction to an ethical problem or an issue of any kind, right? And so then I think there's a second thing that happens though. I think we have a gut instinct to something, and a problem is that we just stop there. But the next step then is, okay, from what perspective am I going to self-evaluate my intuition, right? Am I going to do it egoistically? Am I going to do it from some sort of other normative perspective? So I think there's a sort of a second step in our reasoning, and that second, our ability to get to that second step is based on all sorts of external factors. Part of it's training, which is the work I do, but part of it is also like what's in your way. Like if you're under conditions of stress, you're not going to make that step as easily. If it's a richly sensitive societal issue, right, you're probably going to have a lot of points of stress around that'll prevent you from evaluating it in a fair way, or in a reasoned way, I should say. So I guess that's where I was going. Like I think we start from our intuitions, and then it's only secondarily that we say, oh, I'm going to justify my intuition by thinking about the golden rule or whatever. Yeah. And then the third step would be, okay, now I've justified it. Like, is that a fair justification? That's like a third step in our reasoning process. And that's where the moral psychologists would say, yeah, we sometimes get from 1 to 2, but like very seldom do we get to that third step where we're like self-evaluating. We do a lot of post hoc justifying where we say, oh yeah, I totally meant that thing I decided then in this way, right? I typed in the chat because Lakeland got me thinking about it, and Sterling, sort of the Sterling Kubler Taylor relationship thing. But I'm super interested in this idea of proxemics now, because it's not quite the same thing as epistemics or knowledge claims, but it's like our distance from the problem, which is a combination of values and knowledge. So there's this third component going on now. And those two things in combination, I think, and I've never read this anywhere, but I think there's an argument to be made that the idea that we are ethically sensitive to an issue is contingent not only on our values and our knowledge, but our distance. That's super interesting. Yeah.
I remember an anecdotal saying. They asked a guy, what's more important, empathy or apathy? And he said, I don't know and I don't care. So that's kind of the proxemics thing too. You know, he's really far removed from that, that thought.
I'm happy to stick around for a little bit, but I want to say thank you to Sterling for presenting, and thanks all of you for a great discussion today. I'm really glad we keep doing these little meetings, and I look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, I did want to ask you something because I got very involved in, so my course is divided up in modules. So she kind of presents at different cultures and different modules. And it was really fascinating. This last module is the Japanese still to this day are very pushed back against organ donation. And they can't figure out, because the Japanese tend to be secular, so it's not a religious thing. One thing that they found was the Japanese feel very strong towards, okay, thank you, George. Very, very strong towards returning a favor. So they didn't know if that's part of the reason, you know, you get an organ and I got to give you an organ, that type of thing. They feel very strongly towards that. But more centralized was this idea that in organ donation, our approach to death becomes a event right on time, and they hook people up to ventilators and keep their body going. And the problem is they're trying to determine brain death or pure brain death. And they've had a lot of situations, one of which was a deceased, what was supposed to be a brain dead doctor was on the table, and he did not respond to any of, and I don't know anything about all the 32 different things that they did. His grandson walked in the room and said, "Grandpa, what's going on?" And he sat bolt up. And what's all going on here? Why am I all hooked up to all this stuff? So for the Japanese, they have a real problem with death not being an event versus it's a process. And then I wrote my whole thing on the module on liminal spaces. And I thought that is the ultimate liminal space where they're trying to find that spot between the process of death, brain death versus the next. I said, and I looked up liminal space. I did about a couple hours of research. Nowhere did I find in personal, the only personal liminality that I really found a reference to was transgender change or whatever. You know, they talk about liminality with nature and different things, but the only personal liminality I found much focus on was the process of changing a gender. I didn't find anything on death virtually in that, because I had spoken to you that I thought writing out your last will and testament would be a very liminal moment. But right. Going through this whole process with the Japanese and deciding what death was, I thought, wow, that is like the liminal place.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
I'm not going to hear that. I'm just saying that's my, you know, that was my take on that whole.
Yeah, it sounds like the program's going really well, and I'm glad you're getting the space to think about some interesting issues we didn't bring up in our program here too. So, yeah.
Well, I tend to write stuff, you know, we got to do discussions and talk about, I put my discussion down and people are supposed to respond to your discussion. No one ever writes anything on mine. They never respond to anything, I guess, because it's so eclectic or something. I don't know. Yeah.
But they're just thinking on it, Sterling. That's all it is. They're just thinking on it. Yeah. All right, y'all. Thank you very much for the time. I'll see you in 2 weeks.